He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s.
The evidence suggested that that had occurred after she had been killed.
And that thing just taking over, just wishing that it's not her.
Mark Dixie is a detached, arrogant monster.
Hey guys, I'm happy you could make it back here. All true crime cases are pretty upsetting. I'm sure you'd agree. But some stories have some kind of resolution or give a tragic context to the killer, making the case sad but understandable. Other stories, however, make no sense. They're outrageous, unfair, and end in a tragic loss that no one can ever accept. This is one of those cases. Sally Anne Bowman was an 18-year-old model, full of dreams and aspirations, and living her classic teenager life in London, UK. One day she was partying and trying to resolve issues with her ex. The next, she was dead. And the reality of her murder was so shocking that it scared everyone around her for life. How could such a senseless, brutal thing happen to a young girl who never meant anyone harm? Trigger warning, today's case discusses mature themes and extreme violence. If you're ready, let's dive in. Today's case begins in London, UK. As you probably know, London is a huge city, so big that it's made up of several smaller towns, and the city has gradually swollen throughout time. One such town is Croydon in South London. Croydon is not among the fanciest parts of London. It certainly doesn't have all the historical monuments and red phone booths that you see in the movies. But it has something else, a passion for music and performing arts. Croydon is home to the famous Brit School for Performing Arts and Technology. This school saw Adele, Amy Winehouse, and Tom Holland rise to prominence on the British art scene. The Brit School for Performing Arts and Technology is the very place Sally Anne Bowman studied.
As soon as you could hear her voice in the house, it just brought a smile to your face, and just the whole place was sort of full of sunshine.
Sally Anne was born on September 11th, 1987, to mother Linda and father Paul. Sally and Linda were best friends, and the bunch was bigger than the two. Sally had 3 sisters. But even though Sally, her sisters, and her mom were extremely close, she was a very independent girl and always wanted to support herself and have the freedom to do whatever she liked. So in her late teens, she moved out of the family flat and started renting a room not far away from her old home. In September 2005, Sally turned 18. She spent her days studying, partying with her sisters and friends, and taking modeling gigs.
Sally's modelling was her part-time job, something that she loved to do, always wanted to do from when she was little. Got the opportunity and took it with both hands.
It was late September, and Sally was enjoying a quiet weekend with her mom.
Sally Ann had woken up and just laid about all day in her pink fluffy dressing gown, watching telly, munching on biscuits and crisps and God knows what. And then the phone went a couple of times. It was Sister Nicole asking if she'd like to go out for the evening, as it was Nicole's best friend's birthday.
On September 24th, 2005, at around 6 p.m., Sally Ann started getting ready for the party. She did her hair and makeup, and then she came downstairs and saw her mom. They told each other, "I love you," and then Sally waved goodbye as she headed to the town center.
Sally Ann had gone out with one of her sisters and some other friends into Croydon, and Sally Ann had spent most of the evening up to the early hours in Croydon town centre.
It was still dark outside when Sally and Nicole walked out of the bar and into the central streets of Croydon. The girls headed to Nicole's place with a couple more friends. Then Sally started chatting on her phone with her ex, Lewis Sproston. Sally and Lewis had ended their relationship a few weeks before, but after hours of drinking and partying, Sally was certain she wanted to see him again. When Lewis hesitated, Sally made up a bogus story about Nicole getting arrested for drunk fighting. So at around 2 a.m. on September 25th, Lewis drove to Nicole's place and picked Sally up.
She was picked up by Lewis Sproston, and he drove her back to Blenheim Crescent, which is where she lived.
Lewis drove her home, but when he parked the car, Sally didn't want to get out. Soon enough, the two started fighting over the same things that led to their breakup. Sally wanted Lewis to join her for the night, but Lewis was certain they'd broke up for a reason. He didn't want to rekindle anything, and he saw that Sally had drunk quite a bit. so he didn't want to complicate things any further. But that night, Sally wouldn't take no for an answer. When Lewis headed back to his car, Sally grabbed his shirt and broke his necklace. That was it for Lewis. He said goodnight and drove off.
It was probably around about 4:15 that Lewis drives away from Blenheim Crescent, looks in his rearview mirror, and apart from the actual murderer, was the last person to see Sally Ann alive.
Indeed, just a few minutes after Lewis drove off, Sally was murdered in the most brutal way on her very doorstep. As far as everyone knew, Sally Ann had gotten home safe and sound after the party and was enjoying a relaxing Sunday at her fairly new place.
When she was 18, she was an adult, and she was very streetwise, so, even if I had known, there probably wouldn't have been many concerns. You wouldn't expect that maybe the next few hours she'd be laying in a pool of her own, would you?
No one would, except perhaps one of her neighbors. At 4:30 in the morning of September 25th, Sally Ann's neighbor woke up to a horrible sound.
The witness woke up because they heard what they described as a garbled sound which ended in a scream. Now, they looked out of their window, which looked onto the location that Sally Ann was eventually discovered, but couldn't see anything. It was very still, there was no other noise.
She decided to step away from the window, as there was nothing to be seen, but she still had a very strange feeling. She hadn't dreamt of that scream. Something awful had gone on. So 5 minutes later, Sally Ann's neighbor returned to the window and watched on from a dark room so that she wouldn't be seen.
Hadn't switched their bedroom lights on or anything like that, and they looked out and they saw a man walk down the street in the direction of where Sally Ann was eventually found.
But she couldn't see where the man stopped or what he did next. Since there weren't any more distressing sounds, the neighbor decided to go back to sleep. 2 hours later, she woke up and stepped out of her house to get her newspaper. That's when she saw a pair of legs sticking out of a bush. First, she thought someone had discarded a mannequin in their front yard. But when she went over to take a closer look, she realized the reality was way more brutal. Sally Ann had been for hours and was lying in a pool of red, partially naked.
We know that Sally was at least 7 times. 2 went through her abdomen and out the back.
She had been bitten a number of times.
Sally had also been violated.
The evidence suggested that that had occurred after she had been killed.
This was a horrific murder, and the Metropolitan Police knew they needed to act quickly if they were to catch the killer. But first, they had to do the ugliest part of the investigation: inform Sally Ann's family.
I heard the door knock and I just assumed it'd be Sally Ann. I was sort of panicking, thinking, oh God, the door's all locked up, she can't get in. And as I opened the door, there was a gentleman standing in a suit.
This was a police liaison officer and 2 other officers. As they came in, they asked Linda if she knew Sally Ann. The second time they asked this, Linda was already annoyed. Why weren't they getting to the point?
I said, look, I've told you, she's my youngest daughter. I said, what have they done now? Thinking, oh, the girls have been out, something's gone wrong. And he said, Linda, Sally Ann's dead.
Imagine having to deliver this news, and imagine receiving it. As Linda broke down in tears and screaming, the officers went on to inform Michelle, Sally's other older sister.
I just remember this look in their eyes where you just know there's something that's not quite right.
Michelle was holding her baby daughter in her lap when she heard the news.
And I remember something leaving me that day. And it's never ever come back. I remember sitting there screaming and Ella sitting on my lap saying, Mummy, what's wrong?
It all took an even darker turn when Linda and Michelle were asked to come with the police and identify Sally's body.
I'll never forget, I just remember standing in the car park out the back and you can hear them wheeling her through. And that thing just taking over, just wishing that it's not her. I remember going into the room and for that split second, I thought it wasn't her, because her hair was dark.
Her hair was only dark because it was full of dry. The London Metropolitan Police, assigned to Croydon, had one goal: catch Sally Ann's killer. So the first natural step was to narrow down the suspect pool. Who could have attacked Sally Ann so viciously? Did she have any tumultuous relationships or any exes with a motive? Turns out, she did.
Very quickly, we identified her ex-partner, Lewis Sproston, as someone who was a possible suspect.
After all, Sally and Lewis had recently broken up, and on the previous night, he was the last one to see Sally alive. He'd driven her home, then she was in front of her home. The police put 2 and 2 together, and they figured they needed to arrest Lewis ASAP.
They managed to find him with a brother and a friend of his.
As soon as the police officers approached him and asked him if he was Lewis, he asked them if this was about the argument he'd had with Sally the previous night. This was a huge red flag for the officers. They didn't even know about the argument. Seemed like Lewis was giving himself away.
And they said, Lewis Sproston, you are being arrested for the murder of Sally Anne Bowman. And he had no idea.
Lewis was at the police station for 4 long days. He was questioned for hours on end, and his DNA was taken so that the police could compare the sample with the one found in the bite marks on Sally's body. It wasn't until the DNA results came back that the police could free Lewis. Finally, they knew it wasn't him.
It was a phone call from the Forensic Science Service, which basically said, Stuart, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we have a match to the DNA profile from your crime scene. The bad news is it matches to another crime, another assault 4 years before, only a mile and a half away in Purley.
It was then that Chief Detective Stuart Cundy decided to share every little detail of Sally Ann's case with her family at Linda's request.
And he sat down and said that he was now going to answer all the questions that we had, and our questions were, how did Sally die?
This was not a human being, but a monster who can destroy a person, then bite and violate them as they're dead on the ground. It might have been a small degree of relief that it wasn't Lewis's doing, but the police had to find out who had done the horrific act for Sally and for her grieving family. So the DNA found on Sally Ann's body didn't match Lewis's, but it did match an unsolved crime from 2001.
The attack from 2001 was another truly horrific assault on a woman. A lady who was in a phone box making a phone call when the suspect walks over to her, tries to get into the phone box and over the phone box.
As soon as he was done, he casually crossed the road and walked away from the shocked woman. The police had gathered DNA from that gruesome scene, but it didn't match any in their database at the time, and the case went cold. But now Detective Cundy was wondering just how many crimes this horrible man had done.
If the attacker has done that 4 years before, and then 4 years later murdered Sally in a truly horrific way, what has he done in that intervening period? And if he has brutally murdered Sally now, what might he do tonight? What might he do tomorrow?
He was right. On the very same night of Sally Ann's murder, there had been another horrifying attack just yards away from Sally's place. A woman was just outside her car, standing on the sidewalk and talking on her phone, when a man approached her. He said, "I'm sorry," then proceeded to viciously attack her. But something would stop him.
And I think undoubtedly this suspect would have had done more in an attack were it not for a taxi that drives down Sanderstead Road and probably disturbs him.
In a panic, the attacker grabbed the woman's phone and ran off. But in a very creepy twist, the phone was still connected to the person she was talking to. They could hear the attacker stop very close to the victim, hiding in the bushes and watching the scene unfold. The woman was taken to the hospital by the taxi driver. That night, she gave the police a description of the suspect. Piecing the puzzle together, Detective Cundy spoke to the press and let everyone know who they should be looking for.
He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot. He's of proportionate build, with short, dark hair.
Stuart Cundy knew that the DNA was the most important clue in the investigation. He also knew that they were dealing with a local man, either a Croydon resident or someone who knew the area quite well.
So in consultation with Croydon community and others, I made a decision very early on in the investigation that we would conduct an intelligence-led DNA screen.
So, in the days of late September 2005, the Met Police had to go door to door and get DNA samples from all men fitting the attacker's description. But only South Croydon had about 4,000 men fitting that description. This would be a horrendous task. So the police set up a local DNA center, inviting all white men born between 1965 and 85 to come and give a sample.
We knew fully well that the killer was not going to walk in and volunteer his DNA. But what there is this wider picture that maybe his dad or brother, and there can be a link with the DNA down the line.
Also, ruling people out from the suspect pool is a very important part of any investigation. Through the DNA Center, people helped rule themselves out very quickly. It seemed like the London police were getting closer and closer to the killer. But weeks turned to months, and the investigation was stalling. Yes, thousands of people were ruled out of the suspect pool, but there was no clue that pointed to the murder. By the first half of 2006, the detectives were getting fearful. The killer could have run out of the country by now, or he could be committing several other gruesome attacks in the meantime.
It was a not knowing who he was. It was a not knowing, is he linked to the family in any way? Is it someone that we all know? Is it somebody we trusted?
Desperate and running out of time, the police decided to do something else. They contacted the woman who had been the attacker's victim back in 2001 and asked her to provide a description of him. This would add an extra layer to the e-fit they already had. Of course, 4 years had passed, and even if the woman remembered him accurately, he might have changed his appearance since then. But Detective Cundy wanted to release the image to the media so that it generated another wave of interest, putting pressure on the attacker. Furthermore, Stuart Cundy also released some of the more horrific details of the crime. It was a tough decision for Sally Ann's family, but it was a new chance for people to speak up if they knew anything. Tragically, the press conference that put Linda through a horrific ordeal led nowhere, but it just so happened that soon after, a completely unrelated incident would reveal Sally Ann's killer. It was June 2006, 9 months after Sally Ann's life had been taken. The police were still working hard to find clues, but were losing hope as they felt further and further away from the killer. But one day, the police got a call about a classic pub brawl. A 35-year-old pub chef called Mark Dixie had gotten into an argument with a customer while having a beer and watching a football game.
We believe Mark Dixie was at one of the local pubs in Crawley watching the England-Trinidad and Tobago World Cup game. He'd clearly consumed some alcohol. He'd got in an argument with another male.
The argument turned into a proper fight when Dixie dragged the other man outside in front of a fairly large audience. Soon enough, a police officer spotted Dixie pushing the man to the floor. The officer arrested Mark Dixie on the spot and took him straight to the police station. Had he chosen to give him just a warning instead, Sally's killer might have never gotten caught.
The officer that dealt with the investigation of the assault in Sussex was surprised how Mark Dixie behaved when they were in police custody, particularly when he was being interviewed. They described him as being quite tearful, which they were surprised about because it was a relatively minor case where he'd pushed somebody over.
Indeed, why would you cry if all you did was get into a drunken pub brawl? Surely the police thought he was hiding something worse. Just before letting Dixie go, the police took his DNA sample. He couldn't resist this. If he did, the police would have known he was the killer they'd been searching for. So the police dismissed Dixie and sent the DNA sample to the lab. But it took 12 whole days for the sample to come back.
We received an email from the laboratory that we had actually a DNA hit identifying our offender, who we believe was our murderer.
The police were relieved to finally have a name, but 12 days had passed since he had given the sample, and they knew he could be on the run by now. But a quick look into his record showed something else. He had run off to Amsterdam after the murder, but after an argument with his landlord, he decided to come back to London. In January 2006, he had gone back to his job as a pub chef. In fact, he returned to the very pub he had worked at for the years leading up to Sally Ann's murder.
Why? I'm not entirely sure, but I probably believe that Mark Dixie, who was an arrogant individual, had got away with multiple offending throughout his life, had probably felt when he was bailed from Crawley Police Station that he had got away with the murder.
Mark Dixie was a monster in every sense of the word. He had multiple past convictions: robbery, indecent assault, and indecent exposure. When he was only 16 years old, he robbed a woman at knife point and assaulted her. It gets even worse. That same year, he broke into a woman's car, violated her, then left her tied up inside and set the car on fire. The woman managed to free herself at the last minute and said Dixie seemed delighted in my evident fear. In 1993, he moved to Australia, but soon enough, he committed another sexual offense. He was deported in the mid-90s. In an even creepier turn, Dixie had a girlfriend and 3 sons. He had friends too, and a tight-knit group of people that knew him as a normal guy and described him as the life and soul of the party. His girlfriend and mother of his children had even said of their sex life that it was normal, while her life was about to change forever, as she would learn the very dark truth about her boyfriend's double life. On June 28, 2006, the Met Police headed to the pub Dixie was working at, but they had to get him away from the kitchen, as he worked with large knives and officers were sure he would attack them before handing himself in. Police got to the pub and were concocting a plan to get the chef out of the restaurant.
It was whilst this plan was taking place, we were walking through the car park at the back of the pub, walking to one of the side entrances, and that is when we realised we've identified Mark Dixie.
Dixie had come out of the kitchen for his cigarette break. 2 puffs later, he was arrested. As the officer put his hand on his chest to make sure he didn't run, he noticed his heartbeat, or his breath, didn't change at all. He was as cold and detached as a psycho killer could be. Mark Dixie was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Sally Anne Bowman and some dozen other offenses. He didn't say anything, and he didn't deny any of it.
Again, he gave no reply to when he was charged. In fact, the only thing he'd ever said was when he first brought to the police station, when he was being booked into the custody sergeant, he made probably a throwaway but a telling comment, which was, "I must have been mad to have done that."
Meanwhile, the police had to visit Linda and inform her of the arrest.
I just saw these big, ugly, bulging eyes and this horrible face, and it was someone I didn't know. It didn't make it any easier, to be honest.
There was a sad twist to this arrest. Mark Dixie had committed several offenses in Britain and Australia, and there's a strong chance he committed some in Spain too, as he lived there in the past too. But all of these offenses happened before offenders were required by law to give DNA samples. His horrific crime could have ended so much sooner if he would have been asked to give a sample after his first offense. But now Dixie was behind bars. However, it took detectives 18 more months to track his life and actions leading up to Sally Ann's murder. Finally, a full story was painted. September 24th, 2005 was Dixie's 35th birthday.
One of the things which we were able to establish around Mark Dixie and his birthday was that birthdays were a significant event for him. And his partners described that he always expected something significant for his birthday.
But that day, his girlfriend didn't show up. She just phoned him and told him she couldn't make it. Dixie was angry and quiet for the rest of the night. He said nothing, all while drinking. After the pub closed, Dixie went to a friend's place. After that, they went to bed, and he grabbed a knife and got out of the house. Then, he took all his anger and frustration on poor Sally Ann.
I think that has literally resulted in poor Sally being exactly at the wrong place at the wrong time.
After doing the unthinkable, Dixie carried on with his life like it was the most natural thing to do.
Once he's Sally, goes back to where he was staying that night in Avondale Road, goes to sleep on the sofa, and when he and his friends wake up in the morning, he behaves as if nothing has happened. And I think that really sums up in my mind what Mark Dixie is like, a callous nature and someone who has carried it off like this for most of his life.
In February 2008, Dixie was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 34 years. His only defense at the trial was that he hadn't killed Sally Ann. He just found a drunk girl on the pavement and decided to violate her. It was almost as outrageous as what he'd actually done. As he was saying this, he kept looking at Sally's family with a defiant smirk. Dixie may never walk free again.
Mark Dixie is a detached, arrogant monster who is a danger to the public. He's probably one of the most frightening individuals that I've had the opportunity to deal with in my police career.
But even if he spends the rest of his life behind bars, this offers little solace to the Bowman family.
Justice will never be done. Never. Not the whole time that man's living. It will never ever be done. He's fine. He's got himself a nice little cell, cosied up in there. So what justice is that for Sally? She's not here.
In January 2015, Dixie finally admitted to murdering Sally Ann. He said he wanted to tell the truth and confessed to the murder as well as 2 other sexual assaults.
And I just thought, you know what? That's it. She can finally rest now.
While they tried to recover from the brutal tragedy of Sally Ann's death, Linda and her other daughters are advocating strongly for a compulsory national DNA database. If such a database existed at the time of Sally Ann's 18th birthday, her life could have been spared. Dixie would have already been in prison for all of his previous convictions. Luckily, their pleas did have an effect, and the DNA database is much stronger in the UK at the moment. It's a valuable lesson learned through a horrific ordeal. Thanks for watching, you guys. Hey, don't be shy, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more blood-chilling true crime. Till next time, and stay safe.